Hello, everyone. I'm Shadesha Green, a 2021 Canals Fellow working in NOAA's Climate Program Office. I'm here to welcome you to the sixth webinar in the series presented by the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, NIHIS, Urban Heat Island Community of Practice series. In the first webinar, we learned about the physical hazard of extreme heat on several spatial scales. The second webinar, Constructing Heat Vulnerability Indices, looked at assessing vulnerability and risk. In the third webinar, we started to investigate options and then examine cities that have concrete policies in place to ensure heat risk reduction can happen. The fourth webinar featured communities that have implemented solutions to make their built environment more resilient to heat. The fifth webinar covered the specific theme of green cooling infrastructure. All of these webinars have been following the Climate Resilience Toolkit's Step to Resilience. In today's webinar, we will conclude step 3 of the Steps to Resilience, investigative options. This step examines possible solutions to the highest risk and builds a list of options through brainstorming and checking how other communities have responded to similar issues through inclusive community discussions. Today, through this step, we will be examining the specific theme of community engagement, outreach, and education. To discuss this topic, we have 4 fantastic speakers here with us today, starting off with our moderator, Vivek Shandis, who is a professor and advisor for CAPA Strategies. Before we begin, a few reminders. All of the sessions will be recorded and posted to the NIHIS website and our YouTube channel. We encourage you to post questions throughout using the question chat function on GoToWebinar, which you can see in the control panel. I will now hand it off to our moderator, Vivek, to provide us with a brief overview of our session and case studies for today's webinar. We ask that you stay tuned as Vivek will conclude this webinar by moderating a Q&A session with our speakers. So I'll say thank you and hand it off to you, Vivek.
Hi, thank you, Shay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's a very exciting moment because a lot of this community engagement and outreach education topic has been very close to being able to activate on the other webinars that we've seen, whether it be the power of the pen with policy standards, and engagement around that, whether it be structural and physical infrastructure, blue-green infrastructure, and the integrating heat in all plans webinar coming up as well. This outreach and engagement is one of those continuous threads that I see through all of these different webinars, and aspects of what our speakers will be getting into today will likely touch on the different ways that outreach, engagement, and education have been central to the work on understanding heat and taking action on heat mitigation strategies. Before I turn it over to our first speaker, Lara, I would like to just quickly say that this particular set of discussions, we've had a little back and forth about it, and we've really come to recognize that it has to do, yes, with the mechanics and the logistics of outreach, inclusivity, the issues of equity that run real central to a lot of the procedural aspects of community engagement more generally, though there's other aspects of this that really are highlighted by our speakers today as well. We'll be talking about socializing the concept of urban heat and what that takes, the intersectional dimensions of heat with other projects and other aspects of the work that's happening, as well as aspects of following through with once we understand the distribution of heat in our region, for example, how do we actually follow through and start thinking about ways to keep the heat on, if you will. And so that's really at the core of a lot of what we'll be talking about today. And really these 3 wonderful, informed, engaged speakers that we have today are the highlight of the webinar. And so without further ado, let me start by introducing our first presenter, Lara Whiteley-Binder, who is the Climate Preparedness Program Manager at King County, which is in Washington State. Lara, I've had the privilege of being able to work with Lara on a number of different fronts related to heat and climate preparedness, and really wanting to. She's the climate preparedness program manager, and in that role, she's responsible for working with county agencies to prepare for the impacts of climate change and strengthening regional partnerships to address the shared challenges and opportunities around climate preparedness. I know that she works well beyond the county. She's worked with the city, worked with community-based organizations. And so, Laura, let me turn it over to you to kick us off in this fourth webinar of community engagement, outreach, and education.
Thanks so much, Vivek. And let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen at this time.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So thank you for the invitation to present today. And I just want to emphasize that for King County and the story that I want to tell today, this is really a story that's still being written. So what I'd like to do today is just share our experience and kind of how we worked with partners to get this work done, and lessons learned or just insights gained as we rolled out the results and then start pivoting, and as we've started pivoting towards more sustained action on urban heat mitigation. So in July of 2020, King County and our other project partners, sorry, one moment. Oh, King County and our other project partners completed a one-day heat mapping campaign that was intended to better understand how differences in land use and land cover affect surface air temperature in King County, to identify our urban heat islands, and to provide technical information to support ongoing heat mitigation and adaptation efforts. For reference, King County is located in the central Puget Sound region of Washington State. If you've been to Seattle, you've been to King County. The county is home to more than 2.2 million residents and is home to 39 cities, including the city of Seattle. So partnership was key to getting our project done. Our project's partners are listed there on the right. It included several internal partners within King County, including our climate leadership team and a division within our Department of Natural Resources and Parks, the Ag and Forestry Incentives Unit. It included the City of Seattle's Office of Sustainability and the Environment, Seattle Public Utilities. Of course, CAPA Strategies could not have done this without CAPA. The Weather Service, Public Health Seattle, King County, and the University of Washington. So why these partners? It was really both tactical and practical. So the reality, of course, the practical reality was that no single entity had all of the funds needed to get the work done. We were able to cobble together some funds, but really needed to look to some of our partners to see if we could leverage the little bit of funding we have and pull together enough funds to get the work done. It was also just a function of geography and scale. King County is 2,200 square miles. We wanted to map the urban areas. We have an urban growth boundary in the county that really helps to concentrate development within our more urbanized areas. We wanted to capture all of that, not just pockets of it. And so we really needed to look again at how to work with our partners to try to cover that area. And of course, the city of Seattle was a key part of that. It would have been a major hole in the results to not have Seattle included in that work. We had ongoing existing collaborations already with our partners related to climate adaptation, particularly at the technical staff scale. That was particularly true with Seattle Public Utilities, the Office of Sustainability and the Environment, Public Health. We also had a shared interest in health and equity connections. So the questions that we were asking around how the urban heat island effect may be affecting communities disproportionately, we were not the only ones asking that question, and nor did we want to just develop an answer only for the parts of King County that we could fund. And then finally, there was needed technical expertise. I mentioned earlier, we could not have done this without CAPA, but we also could not have done this without the National Weather Service. And I want to give a particular shout out to the National Weather Service. They work to develop customized forecast products specifically for our project, where they gave us probabilistic forecasting of exceeding certain temperature thresholds that were critical to getting the project done. And this is an example of one of those products. They issued those weekly. And what was neat is that they were experimenting with this probabilistic forecasting, used our project to do that work, and then have now taken that model of probabilistic forecasting and are using it, for example, for forecasting other types of extreme events. I also want to give a special acknowledgement to our Climate Equity and Community Task Force. This is a task force that at the time was working on developing a new section of our Strategic Climate Action Plan, the Sustainable and Resilient Frontline Communities section of that plan. They were key partners in sharing out the invitation to be a driver for this project. And they were, of course, their lived experiences with heat were central in our minds as we pursued this work. So the heat mapping campaign was completed on July 27th, 2020, on a day when we hit 94 degrees Fahrenheit at SeaTac. We had 17 volunteers. So one of the key issues in completing this project was having a big stable of project partners or drivers, of potential drivers. We live in a region of the country where it's not necessarily predictable when we're going to get a 90-degree day in the county. So we had to have a large pool of potential drivers with the recognition that we would probably only get 2 to 3 days notice of when we would be able to do the drive, in which case we would be asking people essentially at the last minute to drop everything and participate in this one-day campaign. As a result, that meant that the big, majority of our drivers were really coming from local government staff, both within Seattle and King County, but we did also have a really good response from the public. People were excited to participate. They all participated in the training that Kappa Strategies offered and patiently waited as we waited for the right conditions. We had several kind of false alarms. So it was a really good exercise for us to get to know our partners and our driving partners, and to really work with them on finding the routes that worked with them, and to be able to use their interest in citizen science as part of this project. As you can see from this figure, we collected over 110,000 measurements around the county. Our maximum temperature observed was almost 99 degrees, and importantly, there was about a 23-degree temperature differential in the county, meaning that an individual dropped in 2 different places in the county at the same time could experience upwards of a 20-degree temperature difference just based on where they were located. So Kappa sent our results in January of 2021, and that started the next round of conversation with our project partners. How do we want to roll this out? And you can see from our results that we had some compelling results. You saw this very clear east-west pattern. Our urban growth boundary almost follows this line of heat that you see. We do have some other pockets that are within the urban growth boundary, but really clear distinction in those temperatures between the more urbanized areas and the less urbanized areas. So we had a story to tell. Now the question was, how do we tell that story? This is where I want to talk about weathering the report release, and I put that in quotes because it will make sense to you in a moment. It's an intentional use of weathering. So first, we wanted to make sure that we were reaching out to our drivers and our other volunteers, our collaborators with the results. So we gave that, we did what we call a volunteer and friends webinar, where we gave them the results first and had an opportunity to answer questions that they had as project participants and collaborators. We also had some webinars with specific city and county staff that we knew were going to be partners going forward in developing actions to mitigate heat. The next step was the broader public rollout. And this is where we worked with our King County Executive's Office, County Executive Dow Constantine, about rolling out a public release and having members from our frontline communities there to participate. And that was scheduled for late May in 2021. And as luck would have it, or as perhaps Murphy's Law would have it, we had a very cold and rainy week that week, not a time to release heat mapping results. So we postponed it till July 7th. And we, were working on finalizing all of our communications pieces, our graphics, getting everything queued up for July 7th. And then the weather intervened again. And this is where I want to move into reflections on sharing out the results. And my first reflection, which is be ready to pivot with the weather when you are looking at a public release for your event. We had on June 20th, so keeping in mind we were planning for a July 7th event, June 20th, the forecast started giving hints about a heat dome coming into Western Washington, which was going to lead us into potentially record-breaking territory. They were looking at temperatures in the 90s, which is hot considering that in the King County metro area, in the Puget Sound Basin, actually roughly only 30 to 40% of homes have air conditioning. So our average temperatures are pretty moderate. So when we get these heat events, they're big news. Well, so this led to some interest from the media. They remembered our July heat data collection event from the previous year. They started calling around, hey, whatever happened with that heat mapping project? Do you have the results? We quickly realized that July 7th was not the opportune time for releasing the events we needed, or the results. We needed to get the report out now. So we quickly pivoted, got the report out on Wednesday before this heat dome was setting up, and we had these forecasted temperatures for the 90s. And it led to some extensive media coverage, top of the fold coverage on the Seattle Times. And it was further magnified by a heat dome of epic proportions where we hit a 3-day heat wave, temperatures over 100, and hit 107 degrees on our final day, and had upwards of 30 people who died from that heat event. My second reflection, people love the maps, but don't assume that the results are intuitive. So take the time to draw out and clearly articulate what the maps are showing. My third point and my third lesson is to really make sure that the equity connections are clear for users of the maps and for the media. So we didn't want to just say that there's a strong equity connection to the results. We made sure that we paired our maps with other maps showing, for example, environmental health disparities from the Washington Tracking Network. The other part of this was, as you're talking to the media about the equity connections, have your frontline community partners tell that story. That is their story to tell. It is not our story to tell as project managers. We wanted to make sure people were aware of the connections, but wherever possible, we brought in our frontline community members to tell that story. The fourth observation is have specific examples of how those results will be used at the time of the release. It was really important to have some tangible examples to really show how this information gets used. So we had already commitments from King County Metro to upgrade bus stops in communities most affected by the urban heat island effect, from upgrading from simple bus stops to bus shelters, and also involvement from our interest in using the products from our land conservation initiative, which is really working on urban greening, among other open space projects. And then lastly, I wanted to emphasize that tackling urban heat is inherently interdisciplinary, and use your heat mapping to start that conversation. So yes, we need more trees, but we also know that this work involves looking at our building codes and how we plan communities. It also needs to include some of those short-term coping strategies. I'll close just with noting that in terms of what's next, we are using our heat mapping results as the technical foundation for developing an urban heat mitigation strategy. This is a project we're pursuing. We got FEMA BRIC funding to do this. And it's going to leverage these existing partnerships from the heat mapping project and then bring in other partners. So this was critical to, this heat mapping work was critical to getting that conversation started, really kind of getting that interdisciplinary, cross-jurisdictional conversation going. And now we're looking to continue it with that urban heat strategy. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. Very insightful, lots of material. I hope you will put your questions. I see a couple of questions showing up in the question set on the GoToWebinar panel here. And we'll come back at the end of the 3 presentations to have a group discussion about it. And since Laura brought up, and before we move to Ollie here, since Laura brought up the heat dome, I'll just make a plug for, if any of you read the New Yorker, they have, today I think was just issued the October 18th issue, and there's a whole piece on 72 hours under the heat dome in the Pacific Northwest. And if you want to see how an ill-equipped or mal-adapted place is to heat, it's something to check out. So with that said, moving on to Oliver Kroner, who's a sustainability manager for the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. So we've worked in Cincinnati as a group, and I was delighted to engage Ollie in this conversation because his work focuses on climate science and urban policy, including energy, transportation, waste, and food systems. He leads collaboration of government and community partners to advance and track the sustainability, equity, and resilience strategies of the Green Cincinnati Plan. His talk is called Sweat Equity, and really trying to put citizen science and partnerships together to beat the heat. So Ollie, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Vivek. Laura, great presentation. I liked your storytelling there. A lot of similar themes you'll hear from me. Before I get into my content, I just want to say how much I like my own title of this presentation. I'm not usually very funny, but I think sweat equity is a brilliant title for what we're talking about today. Obviously, the sweat and heat tie in, but also the equity, right? Heat is one of our largest climate equity issues that we're facing. And then one of the other themes you'll hear from me is that in Cincinnati, we're not a wealthy city. We have to hustle to get the work done, and we rely very much on volunteers and partnerships and collaboration to get there. So most of this probably looks familiar. We're not dealing with the same climate challenges that Seattle is. However, broad themes, it's getting hotter and it's getting wetter. And as we track the environmental costs of climate change, we are now able to point to $132 million of storm and heat damages since 2004. Those are dollars that come out of an already very tight city government budget and dollars that would be going to other things like new police stations, fixing roadways, core governmental operations. So it's pretty easy to point to the urgency of the climate crisis in Cincinnati now. Heat is a particularly big concern here. We're seeing record-setting temperatures over and over again. We have poor air quality, and as you are all probably aware, heat plus poor air quality lead to compounded health implications. We have pretty significant health disparities when we track across geography. We can see an 80-fold difference in likelihood of childhood asthma from one neighborhood to another, from neighborhood to neighborhood, and a 25-year difference in life expectancy from neighborhood to neighborhood. So when we're looking at climate and we're looking at equity, this is front and center. Our climate action plan is called the Green Cincinnati Plan, a broad collection of 80 strategies to reduce our carbon emissions 80% by 2050 with themes of sustainability, equity, and resilience. And reflecting on our progress on these recommendations, I think it is to say that where we have good data, we are able to set strong targets and we are able to meaningfully address the issue. Some of the climate risks are areas where we have not historically had good data, and it's been hard to meaningfully address them. So when the opportunity came forward to pursue a grant from NOAA and CAPA Strategies to model our urban heat risk, we leapt at the opportunity. Very similar to the story we heard from Laura, we put out a broad call for volunteers, tapped our NGO network, had between 25 and 30 people come forward, putting their names down next to the effort to try to help. Also, as Laura described, this was the middle of the pandemic, so everything was weird, more difficult than usual to bring people together for trainings and organization. And we were waiting for the right day, right? So just like in Seattle, we were on call awaiting Vivek's signal to press go and do our analysis. Ultimately, those volunteers traversed the city, collecting over 10,000 data points, mapping our heat discrepancies from one location to another. We didn't see the same extreme heat that Laura reported. However, the clear trend in Cincinnati is you see this bright red band moving through the center of the city. That is our Mill Creek corridor. So the story there is that used to be called the Makatiwa. That was the river that cut the city in half. That was the Shawnee name. And when the city became industrialized, city officials decided to rename that the Mill Creek in order to attract industrial activity, economic activity to the region. And here we are 150, almost 200 years later, and we still have those same industrial scars and lasting EJ issues. Alongside the grant from CAPA and NOAA, we were also selected as part of National League of Cities Leadership and Community Resilience cohort. This was a cohort of cities of different sizes who were attempting to dive deeper into the resilience work. And as I mentioned, we have themes of sustainability, climate equity, and resilience in our Green Cincinnati plan. We pursued this grant in order to operationalize some of our equity recommendations of the plan. So we used those funds to engage in what we call the Climate Safe Neighborhoods program. We partnered with Groundwork Ohio River Valley, which is a local NGO, and Green Umbrella, another sustainability nonprofit in town, to do a deep dive into one of our communities that is experiencing higher climate equity challenges. In partnership with Groundwork, we used our funds from NLC to pay members of the Lower Price Hill community to engage in a series of meetings to discuss what the climate crisis looks like on the ground. I think typically climate action planning is done by subject matter experts, sort of at a city scale. And we recognize that at the neighborhood level, community members are the experts, and that they have a much better handle on the day-to-day and real-world implications. So through those series of meetings, talking through the challenges and opportunities, the neighborhood put forward a community resilience map. So on a block by block level, where are there opportunities for additional tree planting? Where can bus routes be improved? Where are there need for cooling stations, etc.? And along the way, those residents received some engagement and training from city officials and other nonprofits to talk through what programs are available, what resources are available to make this vision a reality. And then building on that, we secured another grant from CAPA Consulting to do the city's first climate equity indicators report. So we compiled over 50 different metrics focusing on socioeconomics, health, some geospatial risk, to begin to map how some of these risks relate to one another. So that lets us ultimately begin to strategize and target specific needs. Because one of the themes we've heard from community members is that we're not interested in another study. We've been studied. We want to get to the action. And when we have these layers of data, it lets us to begin to be strategic and deliver on some of these programs. So for example, comparing the heat map analysis with our urban tree canopy, we can see clear areas where we have communities experiencing high heat during the summer months, but also not experiencing the same benefit of our urban tree canopy. And for a long time, our urban forestry department set citywide targets, a 40% citywide target for our tree canopy. But when we look more closely, we disaggregate the data, we can see that some neighborhoods have close to 70% tree coverage, while other residential neighborhoods have, as you see here, less than 10% in many cases. So now we have established a residential minimum target of 30%, and that is the focus of urban forestry's efforts. And they're making good on that. They now have planted over 85,000 street trees that they maintain on an annual basis. There's been a reevaluation of, given these new temperature projections, given the new climate zones we expect to see in the coming years, how should we strategically shift our planting, tree species selection for the future? It lets us think about where we have populations without access to air conditioning, where we need rec centers to serve as cooling stations, where we need pools and public spray grounds to provide opportunities to beat the heat. Let's just think about policy tools. Just recently, we eliminated parking minimums in our downtown core. What you saw was that area of highest heat and lowest tree canopy coverage. We have required parking spaces for all new construction. Moving away from that policy reduces the amount of impermeable surface, reduces heat island effect, and also gets people out of their cars, which are another source of urban heat. And now, much like Laura outlined, we are considering policies around requiring air conditioning. We have a 60% rental population and a very old, inefficient building stock. Increasingly, the data is showing that thermal temperatures in these old brick building high rises can be significantly higher than even outdoor temperatures. So what can we do to protect those tenants of these rental units? And we continue to learn from our peers. So we have joined the Global Cool Cities Alliance. We are piloting some reflective surfaces on some of our major transportation corridors and now on some of our rec centers to reflect some of that heat, to test whether this is a solution that works well here in Cincinnati. So key theme here across all of our climate equity work is that we need better data, and it can't be citywide data. We need disaggregated zip code data, census block data, or when it's possible, household level data that allows us to be much more accurate in the deployment of our resources, much more surgical in deployment of our policies. And we will continue this theme of building partnerships and collaborating with residents. All of our actions are available at greencincinnatiplan.org. If you'd like to learn more there, or there's my contact information if you would like to discuss anything further. Thank you.
Thank you, Ollie. Very interesting perspective on not only kind of the engagement process, but also scaling that engagement. Really grateful to hear some of that feedback. I see questions coming in. We'll come back to those questions shortly. I wanted to turn it over to Mark Coder, who is an environmental program manager for the City of Austin's Office of Sustainability. As an employee of Austin, Mark works with city departments to embed climate adaptation strategies into long-term operation and asset management planning. In this role, he also supports community organizations to increase climate resilience in the Eastern Crescent. His presentation looking at heat equity in Austin is really looking to connect data with lived experience and then integrate voices of at-risk stakeholders into heat mitigation strategies. So I've had the great pleasure working with Mark as well. And so Mark, let me turn it over to you for 12 minutes.
Great,
thank you.
Thanks, Vivek. I assume you can see my presentation. In this presentation, I sort of want to talk about all the mistakes we've made. I think we made a lot of assumptions in the past couple of years, and hopefully with talking with community members, we've learned how to rethink our approach around heats, but also our approach around city operations and planning. So like most people on this call, we've all experienced this extreme weather happening in the past 10, 20 years. I think some of the things that we're starting to grapple with is what is the relationship between heat and say humidity and how that starts to impact people, but also heat and prolonged droughts. And now that starts to impact our landscape and then also our air quality and disease spreads, et cetera. But also sort of think about what's the relationship between heat and the new realities of, say, precipitation and humidity, that we're starting to get long, hot droughts interspersed with heavier rainstorms. And lastly, that we are in a fire adaptive ecosystem, and that the relationship between heat and water also impacts our fuels and increases our chances of wildfire. The last point, which I didn't put on the slide, but I'm thinking about, is that this year in Texas, we had a really bad winter storm, which nobody anticipated. And that has sort of raised up a lot of questions around what we should be thinking about. And it's not just heat, it's also cold. And we're starting to see that relationship between mitigating for heat also has a relationship with mitigating for cold. So all this is happening at the same time, at a time that the city is growing and the populations with the least amount of resources are getting pushed out, and or their resources are getting thinner. So we're trying to sort of feel, how does this all interconnect? Now, at the City of Austin, for the past 6 or 7 years, we've been working pretty closely with city departments to look at the impacts of climate change on their assets and operations. And by working with these departments like utilities, public works, public health, we realize it's a very much an engineering approach, right? You identify which assets are exposed, which ones are sensitive, which ones need adaptive capacity in order to bounce back from impacts from heat, drought, wildfire, and flooding. But we also learned that this process is very much engineer focused. So after doing this with about 5 to 10 departments, we were feeling pretty good that we knew how to think about resilience and how to think about climate impacts. But when the community starts to ask, like, hey, how's the community going to respond to climate impacts, we quickly realized we had it all wrong. We were thinking so much about engineering, about which are the critical assets, but we didn't have a good sense of what the impacts of climate change was on the community. So when we started to talk to the community, it became really clear that it's not an easy discussion, and that when you talk about heat, it is not just heat by itself, it's heat as it relates to everything else. So we couldn't talk about heat, we couldn't talk about drought, wildfire, smoke without talking about these other underlying issues in Austin that exist in basically all big cities. Everything from disease outbreaks to criminal justice to food insecurities. These were all compounding each other. So we realized we had to rethink how we did this. Traditionally, we as a city would go into the community and make assumptions on what they need, but we realized that was not working. And I'm not sure if Frances would appreciate a huge picture of her on this slide, but I think it's really important to focus on her story. Because one of the things we realized is that we can't really talk about data without connecting it with the lived experience. And we had to sort of better understand lived experience as it relates to the data. And I'll give you one simple story, Frances, that we had 2 years ago. Public health and emergency management came to me and said, hey, we opened up these cooling centers during the summertime and nobody's going to them. Why not? And my response was, well, have you talked to the community about it? And public health and emergency management said no. So I set up a meeting with Frances, who's a community organizer in Southeast Austin, a part of Austin that's low income, and just asked her very broad questions. I said, Frances, imagine it's 110 degrees outside and you lose power to your house. What do you do? I knew that public health and emergency management were going to be thinking, oh, we should go to the cooling center. We'd have, a nurse there. We'd have resources for them there. But her response was, we would probably go to our backyard and drink Topo Chico. Topo Chico is a carbonated drink. And I'm like, okay, so first day in your backyard, you're drinking Topo Chico. Say you have 2 days without electricity. What do you do? And Frances responded, well, when it's really hot out, we'll walk the creek beds, because in Austin, the creek beds are lower. They usually have trees on both sides and they're cooler. And they'll just walk them back and forth until their house is cool enough to go back to. So far, no mention of a cooling center. Then I responded, I said, well, what if you have to go to the cooling center? She's like, well, we probably wouldn't go because some people in our community are undocumented, so we don't really feel comfortable. But if I had to go, the first thing I'd want, Frances said, is I'd want a hug. I'd want somebody to recognize I'm a person in the community that needs help. The second thing I need is an outlet to plug in my phone to call a loved one. And in that second, I could see that public health and emergency response realized that they were not really thinking about cooling centers the right way, and that we needed to meet people where they were. If people were going to stay home in their backyards or walk the creek beds, we need to know where they were to make sure they're safe during a big heat event. And maybe cooling centers were not the best option at that location. So that made us sort of rethink, how are we talking about heat in general? Because when we first started looking at heat maps, they were satellite maps, right? And they tell us exactly where the airport is and big parking lots are. So we took this opportunity to talk with Francis, the community organizer like Coas and Vamos Austin, and other community members, and connect them into this work, so that when we were able to work with CAPA, we were able to talk to the community, talk to researchers and city departments that had some kind of leverage, like tree planting or other opportunities to mitigate heat, and work together to identify where the routes go, where the community sort of thinks the boundary is, and what are those locations we want to drive by to ensure that we're thinking about these things like trailer parks, schools, hospitals, etc. We were also able to collect data, for example, the map on the upper left, that showed where the most vulnerable populations were to heat, and see how we can connect those to the actual sensor data, so that by the end of this process, we had maps that showed more granular information about what's going on in the community. But we also knew from our initial discussion that that's not enough, right? If we knew the temperature at a street, so what? So we really wanted to make sure that we understood what was actually happening at the street level. So we got a little bit more funding to work with Coas and Vamos Austin, the community organizer in East Austin, to start to interview people like, hey, what do you do when it's hot? How do you prepare for it? What are the barriers? Where do you need mitigation strategies to ensure that you're staying cool and safe? And so we did the heat sensors a year ago, and this summer we did the block walks and the interviews with community members, and sort of talk about what are those strategies we should be thinking about. We've only now started to gather it, and some things we're starting to hear is that we have a lot of people in these neighborhoods work outside all day long, and they come home and they have headaches and they're feeling sick and they're not feeling well. Like, how do we start to think about where people work connected to where they live? How do we start to think about those locations in homes that don't have insulation? And how should we start to talk to people about heat to say that, it is a silent killer and that people should be thinking about it? So we're not only now starting to grapple with those topics going forward and trying to think about what strategies the community actually wants and how to meet them where they are to make sure that we're actually making a difference. So with that, we are in the process now of doing more tree plantings with community members in East Austin, trying to figure out ways to pay people to be part of this work and to be part of these surveys so we understand better how to implement our projects in Eastern Austin.
Right, thank you, Mark. Very helpful. If I could have all three of the presenters turn on their webcams, I think we're love to kind of have a panel session where we're able to get into some of this in a little more detail and also a little bit more richness. And I'm thinking just to first start, and please, if you will, those attending, please put questions up in the question box on GoToWebinar here, and I will jump into those right off the bat, and I think you all can read them. First, let me just go from Laura to Ollie to Mark, starting with the idea that there were 17 volunteers in the campaign you mentioned, and was that the number who actually participated, or did you have, were there more trained standing by?
We had about 30 people trained and standing by, but the actual number of drivers was 17. We had 15 different routes for collecting data around the county, and most of our volunteers were able to drive the same route over 3 different times of the day, but we did have a few routes that needed a couple of additional drivers.
Great. And then along those lines, Laura, after you got the maps, another question was asking about any specific immediate heat mitigation strategies that the county developed as a result of the study?
Yeah, so our results, I would say, are still very fresh, kind of hot off the press, but we immediately, King County Metro started looking at the results and started changing the criteria that they use for deciding where they're going to upgrade bus stops to bus shelters. In the north, in Seattle, the primary criteria in the past was ridership levels and rain. And now they realized actually we have to be thinking about summer heat as well. And we need to apply that equity lens to that work. Metro was already doing an incredible amount to apply an equity lens to all of their work. So I want to acknowledge that. But here was an additional resource now that they could use as a factor, an evaluation factor in deciding where to focus those bus stop upgrades. And in another place that we're seeing use of the information is taking the data and overlaying it onto other types of spatial analysis that's happening. So, for example, there was a request back in May to apply the results to look at King County Housing Authority projects with the idea of looking where there's overlap in equity areas and hotter locations in those housing projects, housing authority projects, and so they could use that to identify potential pilot projects for tree planting that would make the most difference. So right now it is, in the near term, it's really about looking at how to bring this information in spatially to try to focus a lot of existing work around urban greening, open space acquisition, transit planning, but more broadly, as we get into the urban heat mitigation strategy development, we'll be able to use this information to really kind of broaden that conversation to a much more kind of comprehensive look at how we're adapting our built environment in both the near term and the longer term to address rising urban temperatures.
Thanks, Lara. I'm curious, others immediate actions that you're considering, short-term actions? I think this might be actually across the board that are coming up, and it's and the extent to which community engagement, outreach, education has been part of the immediate actions that are coming forward as a result of some of your better understanding of the distribution of heat and the lived experience of folks in the community. Any thoughts come to mind, Ollie and Mark?
I don't know if anything is immediate in terms of governmental response. It takes time to roll anything out in a meaningful way. And frankly, if you're doing it immediately, then you're probably not engaging the community. I showed a picture of our spray grounds. That has been one of our core strategies across the city. Pools, we have a collection of public pools that have been expensive to operate, and every time we face a budget crisis, pools get closed. And spray grounds have become a cost viable option that are much cheaper to install, do not require a lifeguard, and kids of any age can participate. We don't really call them cooling stations. It's not that sort of jargon that I think we use in the climate space. They're playgrounds to the people, so I don't think they even necessarily plan to go to the spray ground for heat relief. But I'll tell you, on hot days, there will be people there. So providing solutions that are just sort of integrated into daily life and serve as community convening centers. I did talk through a variety of other strategies that we are rolling. They all will take time to deploy. So typically our pace is more a 5 to 10 year response to this type of data.
Okay, great, thank you. Mark, any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a challenge for us because, if you engage the community's members, you want to do something immediately, because you can't engage somebody and say, okay, in 10 years we'll do something, right? Because they're not going to be around or they're not going to be engaged. We know in Austin that tree plantings typically happen between October and February, March. So we knew that was coming up. So we immediately got the Forestry division involved early on so that we could set it up to align with the community engagement this summer. So to Laura's point earlier, we only do community engagement on heat in the summertime. We made the mistake of sending out surveys on heat in February and got different results. So we are wrapping up engagement now, and it turns out people want trees, so we're giving out 500 trees next weekend. Same as Laura, we're also talking to Cap Metro about putting in bus shelters where people actually need them, not where we think they should be. And they're surprisingly not as expensive as we thought. The other piece of that is just pushing on education, being careful, being aware of what it's like to have a heat stroke, talking to public health and talking to the community. And then we all are also, similar to Ollie, we're doing a pilot for a cool pavement. We asked the community if they want it in their community, and they said no. I think there's a history of using low-income communities as sort of, they call them guinea pigs, and they were worried that it might reflect into their homes and make things worse. So because of that, we are purposely doing our pilot in an industrial area to see if it works before putting it into a low-income area. So it's a combination of things we want to do and things we don't do because of community input.
That's a really helpful response. And part of this is the idea of kind of a process. And I think that's what I keep hearing coming up here is what are the processes that you found helpful in terms of the direct engagement, particularly of those communities who have not historically participated. And Mark, sounds like you really made a lot of inroads into communities and getting the lived experience of what it might be like. Are there other aspects of that that you'd like to lift up in terms of how a city or a public or a county or public municipality, in a sense, and the potential distrust that might be there from previous, like you were saying, using the term guinea pig, from previous applications or approaches that a public agency has had, and the pushback that's there, and how you've been able to navigate that as employees in public agencies, and trying to find the just and equitable way to engage, recognizing that history. Anything that you could say about that?
Yeah, I'd say first and foremost, pay people for their time and their expertise and their lived experience. Because, we have a tendency historically to have a public meeting in downtown at City Hall at 6 o'clock and expect people to show up. And, we have to realize that people have lives, they have kids, they need daycare, they need all these things. We have to do better at meeting where they are. And that means paying people, that means meeting them in their kitchen, meeting them in their churches, where they are. The second piece of that is, I went to school for planning and architecture. I assume that I've learned things and I'm an expert, right? But it's also assuming and taking into consideration that public feedback is also expert vision, expert experience. That lived experience is almost as equal, if not better, than engineering experience or other data we might have. And I think that's key because we have to listen to people to hear what they actually say and to try to figure out how to incorporate that into what we do. And not to assume that, well, you live this way because you live here, but actually, how do we make that place better for those people in a way that's safe and actually takes their lived experience seriously?
Thanks, Mark. Ollie, Lara?
One of my favorite stories to sort of articulate Mark's point is that we rolled out an app, Fix It Cincy. You can report graffiti, you can report litter, potholes, lights, street lights out. We thought it was a great tool to provide citizens access to customer service. And on one hand, it really worked. Things were reported, things were fixed. We had great data that showed how well this great new tool was. But then looking at a map of where the improvements took place, it became pretty clear that there were clusters in more affluent neighborhoods of people who had smartphone access, who knew about the app, who were using it a lot, and other pockets of the city that weren't seeing it at all. So the need to target outreach, target programs, target listening sessions to areas that aren't typically engaged, residents that aren't typically engaged, is just becoming increasingly important. And there are better tools for that. We are trying to raise funds to pay citizens to participate and tap into their community expertise. But it is an ongoing struggle, especially times like this when we're not really allowed to convene publicly.
Actually, I have a question for the panel, if I could. We often get pushback from city staff, not community, city staff about green gentrification, that if we invest in these communities, it'll make it too expensive. And I think it's interesting that it's mostly staff saying that and not the community. But are you guys seeing that in Cincinnati and King County, where there's a fear of investing for fear of pushing people out?
Yes, displacement is a huge issue in the King County region because of just rapidly accelerating housing costs that have gone on now for a decade. So there's an expansion of a transit system. You know, the general expression is, you know, you don't want a bike lane in your neighborhood because as soon as a bike lane comes in, you're going to get pushed out. So I think there's an interest and a desire to have that kind of investment, but also the emphasis that it needs to be coupled with anti-displacement measures. So the communities want that investment, but they don't, based on what we hear, but they don't want to be displaced as a result. So it's about going into it with that awareness and making sure that those programs are, you know, simultaneously in place. I can't say that we've done it perfectly, but it's something we're continuing to work towards, and it's a regular part of the conversation.
We are also seeing rapidly rising property values and rents. For context, Cincinnati is a city that peaked in population in the 1950s and experienced 60, 70 years of decline, and now we are growing again. So we have a lot of housing stock that is in disrepair, a lot of infrastructure. We're built for more people than we currently house. So on one hand, I feel like we are less vulnerable to displacement compared to faster growing, more expensive cities. However, the pandemic has seemed to accelerate the pace of people moving from high cost of living areas to our part of the world, and they're willing to pay more. So that is accelerating these trends. Mark, yes, we hear the concern more from professionals than we hear it from residents, but that's not strictly the case. We hear it from residents as well. Personally, myself, I have more concern about the public health implications of not addressing climate than I have concern about rapidly increasing housing prices.
All right. Thank you, Mark, for that question, and Ollie and Laura for your responses. I know we're right at getting to the top of the hour here, and I'd really want to, at least from my own perspective, thank you for being candid about your experiences with engaging communities and the challenges and some of the opportunities that you've been able to navigate through that process. I'm looking forward to learning more from you and engaging you in the process, and want to turn it over to Shay to kind of bring us around full circle and close the session for today. Shay?
Thanks, Vivek. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. We had a great session. I'd like to give a special thanks to our moderator and speakers, and also everyone that worked behind the scenes to make this webinar possible. This is the end of our 6th webinar, and we will be moving into our 7th webinar on October 28th at 3 p.m. Eastern. And with that webinar, we are going to transition to the next step in the steps to resilience, which is prioritize and plan. One special note I would also like to make is that October 28th is also the day that the community applications for the summer 2022 urban heat island mapping campaigns will be open, and they'll be open for 2 months. So we hope to have many of you apply and look forward to your applications. And thank you again for today. Hope to see you all again on the 28th.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.